Passport to Adventure, Exploring Iceland. Chapter 1, The Call to Wander. Connie sat on the edge of the dock, her toes brushing the frigid waters of Lake Louise. The emerald-green expanse stretched before her, framed by the towering Rocky Mountains, their peaks dusted with snow even in the heart of summer. Behind her, the familiar sounds of tourists echoed, a mix of excited chatter, camera shutters clicking, and the faint whir of a drone overhead. Yet, her thoughts were miles away, pulling her toward a world she had never seen. For as long as she could remember, Connie had been captivated by the idea of adventure. Growing up in Banff, a small town nestled in the Canadian Rockies, she had always been surrounded by beauty, but it wasn't enough. The picturesque mountains that tourists flocked to had become as familiar as the creak of the floorboards in her family's lakeside cabin. Connie wanted more, a world beyond the mountains, filled with new faces, unfamiliar smells, and stories waiting to be lived. Her boyfriend, Steve, shared her restless spirit, though his reasons were rooted in something deeper. Steve had grown up in Vancouver, the son of a single father who worked long hours as a dock worker. While Connie had spent her childhood surrounded by nature, Steve's memories were of the city, the hum of container ships, the salty tang of the Pacific air, and the shadow of his father's exhaustion. Travel is a luxury, his father often said, shaking his head whenever Steve mentioned wanting to explore the world. But Steve saw it differently. To him, travel wasn't just a luxury, it was discovery. Discovery of new places, new people, and maybe even the rhythms of the world itself. Connie and Steve had met 3 years ago at a university outdoor club. She was leading a hike up Mount Assiniboine. He had joined on a whim after spotting the flyer. By the time they reached the summit, Steve had been more captivated by Connie's infectious enthusiasm than the sweeping views below. She, in turn, admired his quiet determination and the way he listened intently when she spoke about her dreams. Their bond deepened over countless shared adventures. Kayaking through the Gulf Islands, road tripping across the prairies, and camping under skies ablaze with northern lights. But each trip left them hungrier for more. They'd talk late into the night about distant lands, Steve imagining the bustling streets of Tokyo, Connie dreaming of trekking through Patagonia. One evening, sitting by the fire pit outside Connie's cabin, she turned to him with a grin. "Why don't we just go?" Steve raised an eyebrow. "Go where?" "Everywhere," Connie replied, her eyes sparkling. "Let's see it all. The world's too big to stay in one place forever." It didn't take much convincing. Steve was as eager to escape the confines of familiarity as Connie was to embrace the unknown. They spent the next 6 months saving every penny, selling off what they didn't need, and meticulously planning their route. Iceland, with its otherworldly landscapes and promises of adventure, seemed like the perfect place to begin. The evening before their flight, Connie and Steve had dinner with their families, a farewell gathering filled with laughter, well wishes, and more than a few words of caution. "Promise me you'll stay safe," Connie's mother said, her hands tightly gripping Connie's as they sat at the table. "The world isn't as friendly as it looks in travel brochures." "I know, Mom," Connie replied with a reassuring smile. "We'll stick to the plan, and we'll be careful." Her father chimed in, his tone half joking but laced with genuine concern. "And don't trust anyone who offers to help with your bags. Next thing you know, you're carrying someone else's troubles through customs." "Dad, it's Iceland," Connie said, laughing. "I don't think they're known for their crime rings." "That doesn't mean you shouldn't stay vigilant," her father countered, his expression softening. "You're my little girl. I just want you to come back in one piece." Meanwhile, in Vancouver, Steve's father was less emotional but just as concerned. "You know what to do if you lose your passport, right?" he asked, his voice gruff as he handed Steve an envelope containing emergency cash. "And don't waste this on souvenirs." Steve rolled his eyes with a grin. "Yes, Dad. Embassy first, souvenirs last." "Good. And keep your head down. Not every place is as welcoming as here." "Dad, it's Iceland," Steve replied, echoing Connie's earlier words. "I don't care if it's the moon. Just watch yourself." As the family said their goodbyes, the mixture of excitement and anxiety was palpable. Connie's mom pressed a small notebook into her hand. "What's this?" Connie asked. "A travel journal. Write everything down," her mom said. One day you'll want to remember every detail. Steve's father simply patted him on the shoulder. Make the most of it, kid. Not everyone gets the chance to see the world. But remember, home is always here if you need it. The next morning, as they boarded their flight out of Calgary, Connie felt a strange mix of emotions. Excitement bubbled beneath her skin, but there was also an undercurrent of fear. Would the world be as magical as she imagined? Or would it be overwhelming, leaving them lost and adrift far from home? Steve, sensing her unease, squeezed her hand as the plane taxied down the runway. "Whatever happens," he said, his voice steady, "we're doing this together." And with that, the plane lifted into the sky, leaving the familiar behind and carrying them toward a new chapter of their lives, one that would begin in the land of fire and ice. Chapter 2. The Land of Fire and Ice. The plane descended through a thick blanket of gray clouds, the wings trembling slightly in the gusty wind. Connie pressed her face to the window, her breath fogging the glass as the landscape of Iceland came into view. Even in the overcast light, the rugged beauty of the island was striking. Jagged black lava fields stretched toward the horizon, speckled with patches of moss so green they seemed to glow. In the distance, snow-capped peaks pierced the clouds, standing in stark contrast to the steaming geothermal vents that dotted the earth below. "Wow," Connie whispered, her voice tinged with awe. Beside her, Steve craned his neck to get a better look. "It's like another planet," he said, his tone equal parts amazement and disbelief. As the wheels touched down at Keflavik International Airport, the two exchanged a giddy glance. They had done it. Months of planning, saving, and dreaming had brought them here, to the land of fire and ice, the first stop on their journey around the world. The airport was small but bustling, with a mix of tourists clutching maps and locals greeting one another with warm hugs. Connie and Steve navigated the arrivals hall with a mixture of excitement and nervous energy. "Let's grab our bags and find the rental car desk," Steve said, glancing at their itinerary. As they waited at the baggage carousel, Connie pulled out the travel journal her mother had given her. She opened it to the first page, where she had scrawled a quote the night before. "The journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step." "I can't believe we're actually here," she said, tucking the journal back into her bag as their suitcases appeared. Steve smiled, hefting both bags onto a cart. "And this is just the beginning." They made their way to the car rental desk, where a cheerful agent handed them the keys to a small SUV, perfect for navigating Iceland's rugged terrain. Outside, the air was crisp and carried a faint scent of sulfur from the geothermal activity. Connie zipped up her jacket, shivering slightly as they loaded their bags into the car. "Ready to hit the road?" Steve asked, sliding into the driver's seat. Connie nodded, unfolding a map of the Golden Circle. "First stop, Reykjavik." The drive to Reykjavik felt like a journey through an alien landscape. The narrow road cut through sprawling lava fields, their jagged, blackened surfaces frozen in time from volcanic eruptions long past. What could have been a desolate terrain was softened by a vibrant, almost fluorescent green moss that clung to the rocks like a living blanket. "This moss is incredible," Connie said, leaning forward for a better look. "It's like the whole earth is breathing." Steve chuckled. "Apparently it takes centuries to grow. Imagine how old some of this must be." The road curved past steaming geothermal vents that sent wisps of white vapor curling into the chilly air. Pockets of wildflowers peeked through the cracks in the hardened lava, adding bursts of purple and yellow to the stark scenery. Every so often, they passed a small cluster of houses with red or blue roofs, their brightly painted exteriors standing out against the muted colors of the land. "It's so untouched," Connie murmured, snapping a photo through the windshield. "Like we've gone back in time." When they reached Reykjavik, the transition was almost jarring. From the rugged isolation of the lava fields, they entered a vibrant city that pulsed with life and energy. Yet even here, the connection to nature was undeniable. The colorful buildings seemed to mimic the hues of the land. Bright yellows, reds, and blues echoed the wildflowers they had seen along the way. What stood out most to Connie, though, were the buildings clad in corrugated iron. She paused in front of one such house, its shiny silver panels glinting in the afternoon light. "These are so unique," she said, running her hand over the cool, ridged surface. Steve nodded, snapping a photo of her beside it. Apparently, it was cheap and durable for the harsh weather here, but somehow they've turned it into an art form. Later in the afternoon, they stumbled upon a small, tucked-away bookstore. Its sign, hand-painted in weathered Icelandic script, beckoned them inside. The interior was dimly lit and filled with the scent of old paper and pine wood. Shelves lined every wall, crammed with books on Icelandic sagas, maps of ancient trade routes, and well-worn travel guides. Behind the counter stood an elderly man with sharp blue eyes that seemed to pierce through the dim light. His silver hair was neatly combed, and a thick knit sweater hugged his frame. He smiled warmly as Connie and Steve entered, his expression one of quiet amusement as he watched them take in the shop's treasures. "Tourists, yes?" he asked in lightly accented English. Connie smiled. "First day in Iceland. Your shop is amazing." "Thank you. It is not so much a shop as it is my memory," he replied, gesturing to the shelves. "Every book here has a story, even if it is just how it found its way to me." Steve pulled a battered journal from one of the shelves. Its cover, embossed with a Viking ship, was cracked and worn, and the pages were thick with faded handwriting. "What's the story behind this one?" The shopkeeper's eyes lit up with recognition. "Ah, that journal belonged to an explorer, or perhaps a dreamer," he said, stepping out from behind the counter. "It was written over a century ago by a man named Arnar. He traveled this land in search of something he could not name, a treasure maybe, or simply an answer to his own restless heart." He opened the journal to a page covered in strange symbols and lines. Arnar wrote about his travels in great detail. He described the land, the people, and the whispers of things hidden beneath the earth. This page, he tapped it lightly, mentions a place where the mountains sing and the earth hides secrets. "What does that mean?" Connie asked, leaning closer. The shopkeeper shrugged, his smile enigmatic. "Iceland is a land of many mysteries. Some are explained by science, others are explained by stories. Arnar believed the two were connected." Steve glanced at Connie, his eyes alight with curiosity. "Do you think it's real?" The shopkeeper chuckled. "Who can say? But the journey to find out, that is always real." As they left the bookstore, the journal tucked carefully into Steve's bag. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a golden glow over the city. Tomorrow, they would venture beyond Reykjavik to explore the Golden Circle, chasing waterfalls, geysers, and perhaps the first clue in a centuries-old mystery. For now, though, they were content to wander hand in hand through the streets of a city that already felt like the start of something extraordinary. Chapter 3. Whispers of the Earth. The road to the Golden Circle stretched before them like a ribbon of promise. Connie leaned against the window of the SUV, her eyes tracing the jagged horizon where volcanoes slumbered under a blanket of mist. The moss-covered landscape transitioned to rolling hills and fields dotted with Icelandic horses, their thick manes billowing in the breeze. "This place feels alive," Connie said, her voice tinged with awe. Steve, focused on navigating the winding road, nodded. "It's like the land is holding its breath, waiting for something to happen." Their phone pinged suddenly with a notification. Connie glanced at the screen and laughed. 4 bars of 4G? Out here? I didn't expect that." "Crazy, right?" Steve said. "Even in the middle of nowhere, we're connected." Connie tapped her phone. "It's good for navigation, but it also feels a bit surreal, like this land is so untouched, yet we're still tied to modern life." Their first destination was Thingvellir National Park, a UNESCO World Heritage Site steeped in history and natural wonder. The park sprawled across a rift valley formed by the separation of the North American and Eurasian tectonic plates, a dramatic reminder of the Earth's restless energy. The visitor center, a modern structure nestled harmoniously into the landscape, provided a brief introduction to the park's significance. Connie read aloud from a display panel, her voice tinged with reverence. This was the site of the Alþingi, Iceland's first parliament. It was established in 930 AD, making it one of the oldest parliaments in the world. Steve whistled softly. "Almost 1,000 years ago. Imagine standing here back then, surrounded by chieftains debating laws." They followed a well-marked trail that led into the heart of the Rift Valley. Towering walls of basalt loomed on either side, their jagged edges casting long shadows over the path. The air was crisp and carried the faint scent of moss and earth. "This is incredible," Connie said, her voice echoing slightly. "It's like walking between two worlds." Steve paused to touch the rough surface of a fissure, the cool stone a stark contrast to the warm sunlight filtering through the clouds. "Technically, we are. This is where two continents meet. The ground we're walking on is literally pulling apart." Connie shivered, though the air wasn't cold. There was something humbling about standing in such a place, a reminder of the vast forces shaping the planet beneath their feet. The trail led them to a large, flat outcrop known as the Lugberg, or Law Rock. In ancient times, this was the focal point of the Althingi, where chieftains and freemen would gather to settle disputes, create laws, and uphold justice. Connie stood on the rock, her arms spread wide. Can you imagine it? Hundreds of people gathered here, their voices echoing off these cliffs. Steve grinned, stepping back to take a photo of her. "I can imagine you leading a debate, that's for sure." She laughed, but her gaze remained thoughtful as she looked out over the valley. There's something timeless about this place, like the earth remembers all the voices that have spoken here. They lingered for a while, soaking in the significance of the site before continuing along the trail. Thingvellir wasn't just a historical site, it was also a place of stunning natural beauty. They followed the path to Silfra, a narrow fissure filled with crystal-clear glacial water. "This is where people dive between the continents," Steve said, pointing to a group of snorkelers donning dry suits. Connie peered into the water, marveling at its clarity. She could see the rocky bottom several meters below, the blues and greens shimmering in the sunlight. "It's so pure, you could probably drink it." Further along, they reached Lake Thingvallavatn, Iceland's largest natural lake. The water mirrored the sky, creating a seamless blend of blue that stretched to the horizon. Birds swooped overhead, their cries adding to the serene atmosphere. They sat on a boulder near the shore, sharing a thermos of hot coffee and a few bites of skyr, Iceland's creamy yogurt-like delicacy. "This is perfect," Connie said, her voice soft. "I feel like we're in the middle of a dream." Steve nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "It's hard to believe this is real. Places like this remind you how small you are in the grand scheme of things." As they made their way back to the visitor center, Steve noticed a small plaque near a less traveled path. The Icelandic text was worn, but an English translation below it read, "The earth remembers. Listen, and it will speak." Connie paused, her eyes narrowing. "What do you think that means?" Steve shrugged, though his expression was thoughtful. "Maybe it's just poetic, or maybe it's something more." They exchanged a glance, a shared thrill of curiosity passing between them. There was something about Thingvellir, its history, its beauty, and the whispers of the earth that hinted at secrets waiting to be uncovered. As they left the park, the words lingered in Connie's mind. Iceland felt alive in a way she couldn't quite explain, as if the land itself was telling a story, and she was determined to listen. Chapter 4: The Mystery at Geysir. The geothermal area at Geysir came into view as the SUV crested a small hill. Connie gasped as the landscape opened before them, an expanse of bubbling pools, steaming vents, and the unmistakable spout of Stråkr, the geyser known for its clockwork eruptions. Steam curled skyward, dissipating into the crisp blue air, and the scent of sulfur hung faintly on the breeze. "Now this," Steve said, pulling into the parking lot, "is what I call otherworldly." They stepped out of the car and joined the steady stream of tourists heading toward the main viewing area. Signs warned visitors to stay on the marked paths to avoid the scalding water that bubbled ominously in shallow pools scattered across the site. "It's like the earth is alive and talking to us," Connie said, her eyes wide. "More like hissing at us," Steve quipped, though he was just as captivated. They found a spot near Stråkr where a semicircle of visitors had gathered. The water in the geyser's pool churned and shifted, as if debating whether to erupt. Connie held her breath, anticipation buzzing in the air. Suddenly, the water surged upward in a towering plume of steam and spray, accompanied by an audible gasp from the crowd. The sheer force of the eruption sent shivers down Connie's spine, and she laughed as the mist settled on her cheeks. "Wow," she said, wiping her face with her sleeve. "That was incredible." Steve grinned, snapping a photo of the geyser as it settled back into its steaming pool. "Makes you wonder what's going on beneath our feet to make that happen." They lingered for a while, watching Stroker erupt several more times, each display as mesmerizing as the last. The geyser seemed almost alive, as though it were performing for its audience. After the crowd began to thin, Connie and Steve decided to explore the geothermal field further. The ground beneath their feet was warm, and the air shimmered with heat rising from the fumaroles. "This place feels ancient," Connie said, glancing around at the bubbling pools and steaming vents. Steve pointed to a small roped-off area with a weathered wooden sign in Icelandic. "What do you think that says?" Connie pulled out her phone and used a translation app. "Danger. Unstable ground. No entry." Steve tilted his head, squinting at something beyond the ropes. "Does that look like a stone marker to you?" Connie followed his gaze and frowned. Partially buried in the earth was a flat, dark stone etched with faint symbols. "It does. But why would it be here?" Curiosity got the better of them. Steve carefully stepped over the rope, ignoring Connie's protest. "Steve, it says unstable ground." "I'll be careful," he said, crouching near the stone. The ground felt firm beneath his feet as he brushed away the dirt and steam clinging to the rock. The symbols became clearer, spirals, intersecting lines, and what looked like runes. Connie, unable to resist, joined him and took a photo with her phone. "These symbols," she began, comparing them to a page in the journal they'd found in Reykjavik. "They match." Before they could examine the stone further, a low rumble emanated from the earth, and a nearby fumarole hissed violently. Connie grabbed Steve's arm, her eyes wide. "Let's get out of here." They scrambled back to the path, their breaths ragged. The rumbling subsided, leaving the geothermal field eerily quiet. "That was intense," Steve said, his adrenaline still surging. Connie nodded, clutching her phone. "We need to figure out what those symbols mean." Back in the main area, they approached a guide who was explaining the science behind geysers to a group of tourists. "Excuse me," Connie said after the group dispersed. "We found something unusual out there, a stone with symbols. Do you know what it might mean?" The guide, a middle-aged man with a weathered face and kind eyes, looked intrigued. "Symbols, you say? There are many such stones in Iceland, often tied to folklore. Some believe they mark places of power where the energy of the earth is strongest." Steve frowned. "Like geothermal activity?" "Exactly," the guide said. "But there's another layer to it. The old stories speak of the song of the earth. This is not just a vibration. It is something more, something that resonates deep within the land. The stones, according to legend, are part of this song." Connie tilted her head. "So what happens if you follow the symbols? Is there something at the end of the path?" The guide smiled enigmatically. "In the old sagas, paths like these often lead to great discoveries or to danger. Some say the stones were placed by early settlers, others by the Huldufolk, the hidden people. Whatever the case, they are meant to guide those who are curious enough to listen." Steve exchanged a glance with Connie, his curiosity clearly piqued. "Are there more stones like this?" The guide nodded. "In Iceland, the land speaks if you know how to listen. Follow the symbols, but tread carefully. The earth here is alive, and it does not always welcome intruders." That evening, in their guest house near Gullfoss Waterfall, Connie and Steve spread out their findings on the small wooden table in their room. "Look at this," Connie said, pointing to the journal. "The path of fire leads to the song of the earth. That matches what the guide said about the stones marking places of power." Steve traced a finger over the journal's faded map, his brow furrowed. "If this path is real, it looks like it leads further into the interior. Somewhere near Hekla, maybe?" "Hekla," Connie repeated, her tone wary. "Isn't that one of Iceland's most active volcanoes?" "Exactly," Steve said, his excitement undeterred. "It fits with the whole path of fire thing." They cross-referenced the symbols on the stone with the sketches in the journal, piecing together fragments of a potential route. Each symbol seemed to represent a landmark: waterfalls, geysers, volcanic craters, all connected by an invisible thread that wound through Iceland's fiery heart. "Do you think there's really something at the end of this path?" Connie asked, her voice a mix of skepticism and wonder. Steve leaned back, his expression thoughtful. Only one way to find out. As Connie drifted off to sleep that night, her mind buzzed with possibilities. The guide's words echoed in her ears. The land speaks if you know how to listen. Whatever lay at the end of the path, She was certain it would be worth the journey. Chapter 5: Gullfoss and the Path to Fire. The trail leading up the lower slopes of Hekla was rough and uneven, winding through fields of jagged volcanic rock. The air grew cooler as Connie and Steve climbed, despite the faint warmth radiating from the ground beneath their feet. The hum they thought they felt earlier was likely the faint sound of distant geothermal vents, but it still added an edge of mystery to their journey. "Do you feel that vibration?" Connie asked, pausing to catch her breath. Steve nodded, glancing at the dark expanse around them. "Yeah, it's probably the geothermal activity, but it feels alive, doesn't it?" They pressed on, following the faint markings in the journal. The symbols, etched like echoes of an earlier time, became more frequent as they climbed. When they reached a plateau, Connie spotted what looked like a jagged crack in the earth, partially concealed by a cluster of boulders. "There," she said, pointing. Steve squinted. "That's a cave, isn't it?" Connie nodded, her pulse quickening. The journal's map had hinted at a hidden chamber near Hekla, and now it seemed they had found it. The entrance to the cave was narrow, framed by sharp rocks that jutted out like the teeth of a great beast. Steam rose from the cracks in the ground around it, curling into the air like ghostly fingers. "Looks inviting," Steve said dryly, adjusting his backpack. Connie smirked, though her nerves were evident. "Let's hope it's worth it." They slipped through the entrance, the air inside noticeably warmer. The light from outside quickly faded, replaced by a dim glow from their flashlights. Connie shone hers along the walls, revealing veins of mineral deposits that sparkled faintly. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "And kind of eerie," Steve added, his voice echoing faintly. The cave sloped downward, the ground uneven and littered with loose stones. The faint sound of dripping water echoed around them, and every few steps they paused to listen for any sign of instability. "What do you think this place was used for?" Connie asked, running her flashlight over the walls. "Shelter, maybe?" Steve replied. "Or a storage area for something important. It's remote enough." They moved deeper into the cave, the symbols from the journal appearing faintly etched into the rock. Spirals, intersecting lines, and runes seemed to mark a path, their presence both guiding and unnerving. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber, and both Connie and Steve stopped in their tracks. The room was vast, its ceiling arched high above them like the inside of a cathedral. Stalactites hung from the roof, dripping water into shallow pools that reflected their flashlight beams. In the center of the chamber stood a stone pedestal, its surface carved with intricate symbols similar to those they had seen on the stones outside. Resting atop the pedestal was a rusted iron box, its edges weathered and worn. "What do you think this is?" Steve asked, stepping closer. Connie followed, her flashlight trained on the box. "Looks like it's been here for a while." Steve hesitated, then reached out and carefully opened the box. Inside was a bundle of yellowed parchment, tied together with a frayed string. "Old documents," Connie murmured, her curiosity piqued. "What do they say?" Steve carefully untied the string and unfolded the papers. The writing was in Icelandic, the ink faded but legible. Connie held up her phone and used a translation app to read the text aloud. "It's a ledger," she said, "from the 1800s. Looks like it lists shipments of sulfur." Steve frowned. "That makes sense. Hekla's volcanic activity would have made it a source of sulfur, which was valuable back then for things like gunpowder and fertilizer." The ledger also mentioned a series of storage sites for the sulfur, marked with symbols that matched those in the journal. "This isn't a treasure map," Connie said, realization dawning. "It's a guide to old mining operations. The symbols mark places where sulfur was stored or extracted." "That explains the carvings we've been seeing," Steve said, "and why they're all near geothermal sites. People were using the natural resources here centuries ago." As they studied the documents, the ground beneath their feet shuddered. A deep rumble echoed through the cave, and loose stones fell from the ceiling. "Time to go," Steve said, grabbing Connie's arm. They hurried back toward the tunnel, the tremors growing stronger with each passing moment. As they reached the entrance, the rumbling subsided, leaving the cave eerily silent once more. Outside, the cool air was a welcome relief. They sat on a boulder, catching their breath and exchanging wide-eyed glances. "That was intense," Connie said, her heart pounding. Steve nodded, still holding the ledger. But we found it. The journal led us to the history of this place. It's not supernatural, it's about people and how they use this land. Connie glanced back at the cave, the memory of the symbols and the documents lingering in her mind. I think this is just the beginning, she said. There's so much more to learn about how people lived and worked here. Steve grinned, his excitement tempered by caution. Well, I guess we're officially on the path of fire now, and it's hotter than I expected. As they made their way back to the SUV, the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting Hekla in golden light. The land felt more alive than ever, not in a supernatural way, but as a testament to the power of nature and the ingenuity of those who had come before them. Whatever lay ahead, Connie and Steve were ready to uncover more of Iceland's secrets. Chapter 6: Planning the Next Steps. The drive back from Hekla to their guest house was quiet, but it wasn't the silence of exhaustion. It was the kind of silence that buzzed with thought and reflection. Connie stared out the window at the volcanic landscape, her mind replaying everything they had uncovered in the cave. The ledger, the symbols, and the history of sulfur mining. It all painted a vivid picture of Iceland's past. This changes the way I see this place, she said, breaking the silence. Steve glanced at her. How so? Connie turned to face him, her expression thoughtful. Iceland isn't just about the natural beauty, the waterfalls and geysers and volcanoes. It's about the people who lived here, who found ways to survive and thrive in such a harsh environment. It's like every stone and every carving is a piece of their story. Steve nodded, gripping the wheel as the road curved sharply. Yeah, it makes you realize how connected everything is. The land, the people, even us, stumbling onto this story centuries later. Connie smiled, her excitement rekindled. We have to figure out what's next. If the journal is a guide to these old mining sites, there's got to be more out there. The guest house felt even cozier after their day of adventure. The smell of lamb stew wafted from the communal dining area, and the warmth of the wood stove was a welcome relief from the cool evening air. Connie and Steve sat at a small table in their room, the journal and the ledger spread out between them. Connie leaned over the documents, tracing the faint lines of the map in the journal. The symbols in the ledger match some of the ones in the journal, she said, her voice steady with focus. If we can figure out where the next site is, we might learn even more about how this area was used. Steve nodded, scrolling through his phone. I found an old article about sulfur mining in Iceland. Apparently, it was a big deal in the 18th and 19th centuries. They'd extract sulfur near volcanic sites and ship it out for trade. Makes sense considering how much volcanic activity is around here. Connie tapped a spot on the map. Look at this symbol near Myrdalsjökull. It's different from the others. It looks like it could be another site. Myrdalsjökull? Steve said, raising an eyebrow. That's a glacier. You think there's something there? Connie shrugged, a grin tugging at her lips. Only one way to find out. The two of them began sketching out a plan for the next leg of their journey. The site near Myrdalsjökull wasn't far from their current location, but it would require navigating some rugged terrain. We'll need to pack extra supplies, Steve said, making a list on his phone. Water, snacks, warm clothes. Glaciers aren't exactly tropical. Connie added, and let's double-check the car. If we're going off-road again, we need to make sure we're ready for anything. Steve looked at her, his expression serious but tinged with excitement. You know, we're diving into Iceland's history in a way most tourists don't. It's kind of incredible. Connie nodded, her eyes shining. That's what makes this so special. It's not just sightseeing. It's connecting with the past, with the people who lived here. And the fact that we're piecing it together ourselves, it's like we're uncovering a hidden story. They spent the rest of the evening cross-referencing the ledger's notes with maps of the area, searching for clues that might lead them to the next site. As the hours passed, the picture grew clearer. Sulfur mining had left its mark on Iceland, not just in its history books, but in its landscapes. Later that night, they stepped outside to take in the stars. The air was crisp, and the sky was impossibly clear, the Milky Way stretching across it like a ribbon of light. Iceland feels different at night, Connie said, wrapping her arms around herself. Quieter, like it's waiting for something. Steve glanced at her, then back at the sky. Maybe it's waiting for us to figure this out. Connie laughed, but her gaze remained on the horizon. You know, even if we don't find anything else, this trip has already been worth it. It's made me see the world and myself differently. Steve nodded, his expression thoughtful. Same here. But I have a feeling there's more out there, and I'm not ready to stop looking. They stood in silence for a while, the stars above and the land around them a reminder of how vast and interconnected the world truly was. Tomorrow, they would set out for Myrdaljakul, ready to uncover the next chapter of Iceland's story. Chapter 7: The Glacier's Secret. The road to Myrdaljakul Glacier was unlike anything Connie and Steve had experienced so far. As they left the lowlands behind, the landscape shifted dramatically. The stark, moss-covered lava fields gave way to stretches of black sand plains, dotted with massive boulders carried there centuries ago by glacial floods. Towering mountains loomed on either side, their peaks partially shrouded in mist. Connie gazed out the window, her breath fogging the glass. I can't get over how vast this place feels, like it just goes on forever. Steve, focused on navigating the rugged road, nodded. It's humbling. You realize how small you are out here. The air grew colder as they approached the glacier, and patches of ice began to appear along the roadside. Their SUV handled the rough terrain well, but the bumps and dips in the road kept them alert. Do you think anyone's been out here recently? Connie asked, scanning the horizon. Doesn't look like it, Steve replied, pointing to the unmarked expanse ahead. We're definitely off the beaten path now. They parked the SUV near the base of the glacier, where a faint trail led upward. The air was crisp and sharp, carrying the clean, almost metallic scent of ice. Connie wrapped her scarf tightly around her neck, her boots crunching on the frozen ground. Myrdaljakul was immense, its blue-white surface stretching into the horizon like a frozen river. Cracks and crevices marked its face, some small enough to step over, others deep enough to disappear into. This is incredible, Connie said, her voice tinged with awe. And intimidating, Steve added, adjusting his backpack. Let's be careful, glaciers can be unpredictable. Connie pulled out the journal, flipping to the map they had pieced together the night before. According to this, the symbol we're looking for should be near a moraine, maybe where the glacier meets the rocks. They followed the faint trail, stopping occasionally to scan the area for any sign of the markings. The cold seeped through their jackets, but the excitement of the search kept them moving. After nearly an hour of hiking, Connie spotted something unusual near the edge of the glacier. A cluster of rocks jutted out from the ice, their surfaces dark and slick. Among them was a flat stone, its surface etched with the now familiar symbols. There, she called, quickening her pace. Steve hurried to join her, his breath visible in the cold air. It's another marker, he said, crouching to get a better look. The markings were similar to the ones they had seen at Hekla and Gullfoss, but these were more intricate, almost geometric in design. Steve snapped several photos while Connie compared the symbols to the journal. This one's different, she said, tracing the lines with her gloved finger. It's not just a marker, it looks like a diagram. Steve frowned, studying the pattern. Could it be a map, or maybe instructions? Nearby, a faint glint of metal caught Connie's eye. She stepped closer, brushing away the snow to reveal what appeared to be an old iron stake embedded in the ground. Attached to it was a small, rusted plate, its surface engraved with Icelandic text. Connie quickly took a photo and used her phone's translation app. Site of sulfur extraction, 1883, she read aloud. Steve raised an eyebrow. So this was another mining site? Looks like it, Connie said, glancing at the glacier. The miners must have worked right up to the edge of the ice. Steve stood, scanning the area. The symbols and the stake, this wasn't just any site. It feels important somehow. Connie nodded, like it was a key location. But why mark it so carefully? What were they trying to preserve or protect? As they prepared to head back, the glacier groaned, a low, resonant sound that echoed through the valley. Connie froze mid-step, her pulse quickening. Did you hear that? She asked, her voice a mix of awe and apprehension. Steve stopped beside her, his eyes scanning the ice. Yeah, I heard it. Glaciers make noise, right? It's probably normal. Connie nodded slowly, though her gaze lingered on the massive sheet of ice. I think so, but why does it sound so Alive. Steve adjusted his backpack and glanced at the glacier's surface. It's the ice shifting, he said, recalling a documentary he'd watched years ago. Glaciers are constantly moving, even if we can't see it. That groaning sound happens when the ice compresses or slides over the bedrock beneath it. It's basically the glacier's version of creaking floorboards. Connie tilted her head, listening as another deep rumble vibrated through the air. So it's like the glacier is settling? Exactly, Steve replied. But sometimes it can be a warning. If the ice is cracking or a chunk is about to calve off, the sounds can get louder or sharper, more like cracking than groaning. That's when it gets dangerous. Connie shivered, her gaze fixed on the glacier. And what about those vibrations we felt earlier? Are they connected? Steve nodded. Probably. The weight of the glacier causes stress on the ground underneath it, and as the ice moves, it can create tremors. If there's a lot of noise and vibration together, it might mean a big shift is happening, like a collapse or an icefall. Connie glanced at the crevices they had passed earlier, their edges sharp and shadowed. So if we start hearing cracking, we move fast, Steve finished, his tone serious. They continued down the trail, their footsteps quick but cautious. The groaning sounds became sporadic, fading into the distance as they moved further from the glacier's edge. Connie couldn't help but glance back, the sheer size and power of Myrdalsjökull leaving her both awestruck and wary. The weight of the glacier. As they reached the SUV, Connie leaned against the hood, catching her breath. I didn't realize how much a glacier changes, she said. Steve joined her, brushing snow from his jacket. Yeah, they seem so solid and permanent, but they're always moving. Ice melts, refreezes, and flows downhill, even if it's just a few centimeters a day. It's slow, but it's relentless. Connie nodded, her thoughts lingering on the vibrations and the sounds they had heard. Makes you respect the land even more. It's not just beautiful, it's powerful and unpredictable. Steve smiled, though his expression was tinged with caution. Exactly. The people who lived and worked here must have known that. They weren't just surviving the environment, they were working with it, finding ways to adapt. As they climbed into the SUV and started the engine, the faint sound of the glacier's groaning drifted through the open window. It was a reminder that while the landscape might seem timeless, it was anything but static. That evening, back in the warmth of their guest house, Connie and Steve spread their findings across the small table. The photos of the symbols, the journal, and the rusted plate painted a clearer picture of Iceland's sulfur mining history. This wasn't just about mining, Connie said, her voice steady. The people who worked here knew how dangerous it was. The symbols, they were warnings as much as guides. Steve nodded. And the locations they marked, they're all places where the land is most active. Geysers, volcanoes, glaciers. It's like they were mapping the heartbeat of Iceland. Connie traced the lines of the journal map, her brow furrowed. Do you think they were looking for something? Or just trying to survive? Maybe both, Steve said. But whatever it was, they left behind a story, and we're just starting to uncover it. As the night deepened, they began planning their next steps, determined to follow the path wherever it led. Iceland had already revealed so much, but Connie and Steve both felt there was still more to discover, more connections to the past, more secrets hidden in the land's fiery heart. Chapter 8. Uncovering the Next Clues. Back at the guest house, Connie and Steve sat at the small wooden table in their room, their findings spread before them. The journal, the photos of the symbols, and the notes they had taken so far created a collage of clues. But the bigger picture still eluded them. This ledger we found, Connie began, holding up the brittle pages they had recovered near Hekla. It gives us dates, locations, and materials, but it's also fragmented. I wish we could find more context. Steve leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. If it's a mining ledger, there must have been records somewhere, maybe archives in Reykjavik or another major town? Connie nodded thoughtfully. Maybe, but what about the symbols? They're not just practical markers. They feel deliberate, like the miners wanted to leave behind more than just a map. Steve flipped through the journal, pausing at a page that depicted several interconnected symbols. Could they have been documenting geological features? Maybe these represent areas with specific geothermal activity. Connie brightened. That makes sense. The symbols we've seen so far are all tied to places with geothermal energy: Geyser, Hekla, and now the glacier. It's almost like they were mapping the most active parts of Iceland. They pulled up a map of Iceland on Steve's laptop, overlaying it with the photos of the journal pages and the ledger entries. Slowly, a pattern began to emerge. "Look at this," Connie said, pointing to a series of symbols on the journal's map. "If we connect these locations, they form a rough arc across the southern part of Iceland." Steve traced the line with his finger. "That arc follows the mid-Atlantic ridge, doesn't it? The boundary where the tectonic plates meet." Connie's eyes widened. "That's it. The miners weren't just marking extraction sites. They were mapping areas of high geothermal activity along the ridge. They must have realized how important these places were, not just for mining, but for understanding the land itself." Steve leaned closer, his excitement growing. "But why would they leave these symbols instead of writing it all down in plain text? Was it to keep their knowledge safe? Or maybe they thought the symbols would last longer than paper?" "Or both," Connie said, her voice tinged with wonder. "Whatever the reason, they left us a trail to follow. And look at this. There's another symbol here, near the Laki craters. That could be our next stop." Before turning in for the night, Connie remembered the historian they had met at the Reykjavik bookstore. His name was Arni Bjornsson, a soft-spoken man in his 60s with a passion for Icelandic folklore and history. She quickly composed an email explaining their findings and attaching photos of the journal, the ledger, and the symbols they had discovered. "Think he'll respond?" Steve asked, glancing at the screen. "If he's anything like us, he won't be able to resist diving into this mystery," Connie said with a grin. They didn't have to wait long. Early the next morning, Connie's phone chimed with a reply. She opened the email eagerly, reading aloud as Steve leaned over her shoulder. "Dear Connie and Steve, thank you for reaching out and sharing your intriguing discoveries. The symbols you found are indeed remarkable and appear to be connected to Iceland's mining history, specifically sulfur extraction sites from the late 18th to early 19th century. Sulfur was a highly valuable resource during this period, used in gunpowder and exported widely across Europe. The symbols themselves are fascinating. They resemble traditional Icelandic staves, which were often used as protective or guiding symbols. However, these staves were typically associated with folklore and magic, while the ones you found seem more practical, possibly a system of navigation or marking specific geological features. The ledger you discovered adds another layer to the story. The mention of sulfur shipments and specific dates aligns with records from Iceland's sulfur trade boom. If you're planning to explore the Laki craters, be cautious. That area was devastated by the eruption of 1783, and the landscape remains rugged and unpredictable. I would be happy to meet with you in person if you return to Reykjavik. I can help you access archives that may shed more light on these symbols and the miners who left them behind. Let me know how I can assist further. Best regards, Arni Bjornsson." Connie set her phone down, her mind racing. This confirms it. These symbols aren't random. They're tied to Iceland's history in a way we're just beginning to understand. Steve nodded, scrolling through a map of the Laki craters on his laptop. If Arnie's right, the staves might have been a practical tool for navigating this wild landscape. But why go to so much effort to carve them into stones? What were they trying to ensure people would find or avoid? Connie grabbed her notebook and began jotting down questions. "When we're done at Laki, we should head back to Reykjavik and meet with Arnie. If there are archives we can access, we might uncover the whole picture." Steve grinned. "But first, the Laki craters. Let's finish piecing together this map." As they reviewed their gear and finalized their route, the anticipation grew. The journey was no longer just about exploring Iceland's natural beauty. It had become a quest to uncover the stories hidden in its landscapes, stories that tied the past to the present in ways they had never imagined. Chapter 9. The Laki Craters. The road to the Laki Craters was one of the most remote and rugged routes Connie and Steve had tackled so far. The landscape seemed otherworldly, a vast expanse of jagged lava fields, black sand, and patches of moss that clung stubbornly to the barren earth. Towering volcanic ridges loomed on the horizon, their peaks still scarred by the catastrophic eruption of 1783. Connie gazed out the window, her voice hushed. It's hard to believe this land was once flowing with lava. It's beautiful in a haunting way. Steve nodded, his hands steady on the wheel. Yeah, you can feel the history here, like the land hasn't forgotten what happened. The SUV bumped along the unpaved road, the sound of gravel crunching under the tires blending with the faint whistle of the wind. They passed no other vehicles, and the isolation was palpable. This is the kind of place where you realize how small you are, Connie said, breaking the silence. And how big the world really is, Steve added, glancing at her with a grin. When they reached the base of the Laki craters, the scale of the eruption's devastation became clear. The craters stretched in a line as far as the eye could see, like open wounds in the earth. Steam rose from fissures in the ground, a reminder that the volcanic activity beneath the surface was still alive. They parked the SUV and stepped out, the cold wind biting at their cheeks. Connie tightened her scarf as she scanned the area. According to the journal, there should be another symbol here, she said, pulling out the map they had pieced together. Steve adjusted his backpack, his breath visible in the frigid air. Let's stick to the trail as much as we can. This terrain looks unforgiving. They began their ascent, following a faint path that wound between the craters. The ground beneath their boots was rough and uneven, a mix of hardened lava and loose volcanic ash. After nearly an hour of hiking, Connie spotted something unusual on a flat rock near one of the smaller craters. "Over there," she called, quickening her pace. Steve followed, his pulse quickening as they approached the rock. Etched into its surface was another symbol, similar to the ones they had found before but more elaborate. "This one's different," Connie said, running her gloved fingers over the carvings. "It's more intricate." Steve crouched beside her, snapping photos. "It looks almost ceremonial, like it was meant to mark something important." Nearby, a partially buried iron stake caught Steve's eye. He brushed away the ash, revealing a rusted plate similar to the one they had found at Myrdalsjökull. The engraved text was faint but legible. "Site of extraction, Laki, 1784. "This confirms it," Steve said, holding up the plate. "This was another mining site. They must have come here after the eruption to harvest sulfur." Connie nodded, her mind racing. But why leave the symbol here? Was it to guide others to this spot? Or were they marking the site for another reason? She pulled out the journal, comparing the symbol on the rock to the sketches in the margins. "This matches the one near the glacier. It's like they were creating a network of markers across the island." As they sat near the crater, catching their breath, Connie looked out over the desolate landscape. The scars of the eruption were still raw, even centuries later, but patches of green moss and wildflowers hinted at the land's slow recovery. "It's amazing how resilient this place is," she said. "Even after something as devastating as the Laki eruption, life still finds a way to come back." Steve nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "And the people who lived through it, they didn't just survive. They adapted, found ways to use the land, even in the aftermath." Connie smiled. "That's what makes this so incredible. These symbols, the ledger, they're not just relics. They're stories of resilience, of people working with the land instead of against it." As they prepared to head back to the SUV, Connie flipped through the journal one last time. Her eyes landed on a line of text she hadn't noticed before, written in faint, slanted handwriting near the symbol for Laki. It says, "The key lies where the fire meets the ice," she read aloud. Steve frowned. "Fire and ice? That could mean a lot of places in Iceland. It's practically the country's tagline." Connie laughed, but her mind was already working. What if it's referring to a specific place, somewhere where geothermal activity and glaciers collide? "Like another volcanic site near a glacier," Steve suggested. Connie nodded. "That narrows it down. We'll need to do more research, but I think this is pointing us to the next site." By the time they returned to the guest house, the sky was dark, and the stars shone brightly above the rugged landscape. Over steaming mugs of tea, Connie and Steve reviewed their findings, plotting the locations they had visited and cross-referencing them with the journal. "This journey is turning into something much bigger than I expected," Steve said, his tone reflective. Connie smiled, her eyes alight with excitement. "And we're just getting started. The more we uncover, the more connected I feel to this place and the people who were here before us. Steve leaned back in his chair, a grin tugging at his lips. So, where to next? Connie traced her finger along the map, stopping at a spot where a glacier and a volcanic ridge intersected. Here, she said, her voice steady with determination. Let's see what the fire and ice have to tell us. Chapter 10. Preparing for Fire and Ice. The next morning, Connie and Steve woke early, their minds already racing with the possibilities of what lay ahead. The faint line in the journal, "The key lies where the fire meets the ice," had ignited their curiosity. It was a clue, cryptic yet tantalizing, pointing to a place where Iceland's dual forces of nature collided. They sat at the dining table in the guest house, their laptops open, maps spread out, and steaming cups of coffee within reach. The soft hum of other travelers preparing for their day filled the background, but Connie and Steve were laser-focused on their task. Iceland has no shortage of places where fire meets ice, Connie said, scrolling through a list of geothermal areas near glaciers. But if we're narrowing it down, it has to be somewhere significant, somewhere tied to mining or exploration. Steve nodded, pulling up a detailed map of the country. We've already been to Hekla and Mýrdalsjökull. The next logical place would be somewhere along the same volcanic belt. What about Grímsvötn? Connie paused, considering the suggestion. Grímsvötn, one of Iceland's most active volcanoes, lay beneath the massive Vatnajökull glacier. Its eruptions had created catastrophic floods, known as jökullaups, when the ice melted rapidly. That makes sense, she said. It's dramatic enough to match the journal's description. And if there was sulfur mining there, it would explain why the area might have been marked. Steve leaned closer, pointing to the map. There's a trailhead near Skaftafell National Park that leads toward Vatnajökull. If we start there, we might be able to find another marker or something connected to the symbols. Before committing to their next destination, Connie decided to email Arni Bjornsson, the historian who had responded so quickly to their earlier message. She outlined their findings at the Loki craters and shared the cryptic line from the journal. Within a couple of hours, a reply came through. Dear Connie and Steve, your discovery at the Loki craters is fascinating, and your interpretation of the journal seems accurate. The phrase, "where fire meets ice," is likely a reference to areas like Grímsvötn or other volcanic sites beneath glaciers. These regions were critical for sulfur extraction due to their unique geological conditions. It is also worth noting that Icelanders often used poetic language to describe the interplay of natural forces, which may explain the phrasing. If you plan to explore Vatnajökull, I recommend checking the weather and trail conditions carefully. The glacier and surrounding areas can be treacherous, especially if there is recent volcanic activity or unstable ice. Let me know if I can assist further. Best regards, Arni Bjornsson. Connie read the email aloud, her excitement growing. This confirms we're on the right track. Grímsvötn and Vatnajökull are definitely worth exploring. The couple spent the rest of the day preparing for what promised to be their most challenging trek yet. They laid out their gear, double-checking each item against their list. Sturdy hiking boots for navigating uneven ice and rocky terrain. Thermal layers and waterproof jackets to withstand the cold, unpredictable weather near the glacier. Crampons and ice axes, rented from a local outfitter to ensure safe footing on the glacier. A portable stove and food supplies for long days in the field. A GPS device and maps, as well as their phones for navigation. Steve also made sure their SUV was ready for the rugged journey ahead. He checked the tires, topped off the fuel, and loaded extra water and a first aid kit into the trunk. We're basically turning into Arctic explorers, he joked as he packed the supplies. Connie grinned, adjusting the straps on her backpack, and loving every minute of it. That evening, they stepped outside the guest house to take in the view. The sky was clear, and the stars seemed impossibly bright, stretching across the vast Icelandic sky like a blanket of light. Connie wrapped her arms around herself, her breath visible in the crisp air. I never thought we'd be doing something like this. Following symbols, uncovering history, exploring glaciers and volcanoes. It feels surreal. Steve nodded, his hands stuffed into his jacket pockets. It's not just about the places we're seeing, it's the story we're uncovering. It's like we're walking in the footsteps of people who were here centuries ago, trying to make sense of the same forces we are. Connie smiled, her gaze fixed on the horizon. And the more we learn, the more connected I feel to this place. It's like Iceland has its own language, and we're just starting to understand it. Steve chuckled. Well, I hope the next chapter in this story doesn't involve us getting stuck in a glacier crevasse. Connie laughed, but her expression grew thoughtful. Whatever we find at Vatnajökull, I have a feeling it's going to be something we'll never forget. As the first rays of sunlight lit up the landscape, Connie and Steve loaded their gear into the SUV and set off for Skaftafell National Park. The journey ahead was daunting, but their excitement outweighed any apprehension. The road stretched out before them, cutting through vast lava fields and alongside roaring rivers fed by glacial melt. With every mile, the air grew colder, and the silhouette of Vatnajökull loomed larger on the horizon. Ready for fire and ice? Steve asked, his tone playful, but laced with anticipation. Connie nodded, her eyes alight with determination. Let's see what this land has to tell us next. Chapter 11, Skaftafell and the Glacier of Fire and Ice. The drive to Skaftafell National Park took Connie and Steve through some of the most striking landscapes they had encountered yet. The scenery shifted from sprawling black sand plains to towering cliffs dotted with waterfalls that tumbled from great heights. Vatnajökull, the massive glacier that dominated the horizon, seemed to grow larger with every mile. This place is unreal, Connie said, her voice filled with awe. It's like we've stepped into another world. Steve nodded, his eyes fixed on the road. Yeah, and that world looks like it could swallow us whole. As they neared the park, signs of the glacier's reach became evident. Meltwater rivers snaked through the land, carving deep channels in the volcanic soil. The air grew colder, and the sky took on a steely hue, reflecting the icy expanse ahead. They parked at the visitor center, a modern structure nestled at the base of a ridge, with a panoramic view of the glacier's tongue extending into the valley. Inside, a small group of hikers prepared for their treks, chatting in hushed tones as they checked their gear. Connie and Steve approached the counter, where a friendly ranger greeted them. Planning to head up to the glacier? The ranger asked, glancing at their backpacks. Connie nodded. We're looking to explore near Grimsvötn. Do you have any advice? The ranger raised an eyebrow. That's quite a trek. Grimsvötn is active, and the glacier around it can be unpredictable. Stick to the marked paths and keep an eye on the weather. It can change fast up there. Steve nodded. We've got crampons and ice axes, and we'll check conditions before heading out. The ranger smiled, handing them a detailed map of the area. Good luck, and stay safe. Vatnajökull has a way of humbling even the most experienced explorers. The path to the glacier's edge was well marked, winding through a rocky landscape dotted with patches of hardy vegetation. As they climbed higher, the air grew colder, and the terrain turned to ice. Connie and Steve strapped on their crampons, the metal spikes crunching into the glacier's surface with each step. This is incredible, Connie said, her breath visible in the icy air. It's like walking on another planet. Steve grinned, his face flushed from the cold. Yeah, but keep an eye on those crevasses. They look deep enough to swallow a car. The glacier's surface was a mosaic of shimmering blue ice and darker patches where volcanic ash had settled. The contrast was striking, a reminder of the ongoing battle between fire and ice that shaped the land beneath their feet. After hours of careful trekking, they reached a plateau overlooking a vast expanse of ice. Connie pulled out the journal, scanning the area for any sign of the symbol they were searching for. There, she said, pointing to a boulder partially embedded in the ice. Steve followed her gaze, his heart pounding. As they approached, the familiar markings became clear. The symbol was etched deeply into the rock, surrounded by smaller, almost decorative carvings. This one's even more detailed than the others, Connie said, running her gloved fingers over the grooves. It's like they were building up to something. Steve knelt beside her, studying the carvings. It almost looks like a map, he said, tracing the lines with his finger. These curves and circles, they could represent geothermal vents or glacial features. Connie nodded, pulling out her phone to take photos. If this is a map, it's pointing us towards something specific. But what? Nearby, a rusted iron rod protruded from the ice, similar to the markers they had found at Laki and Myrdalsjökull. Steve cleared away the frost, revealing another engraved plate. "This one's newer," he said, squinting at the text. "Survey marker, Grimsvötn region, 1904. Connie tilted her head, her curiosity piqued. So people were still studying this area long after the mining operations ended. Why? What were they looking for? As they lingered near the symbol, the glacier groaned, a deep, resonant sound that reverberated through the ice. Connie and Steve exchanged a glance, their earlier excitement giving way to caution. "We should move," Steve said, his tone serious. "The ice could be shifting." They carefully retraced their steps, the sound of cracking ice following them as they descended. The groaning noises were a stark reminder of the glacier's unpredictability, a place where natural forces operated on a scale far beyond human control. Back at the visitor center, they spread their findings across a table, comparing the photos of the symbol to the journal's sketches. "This symbol is more than just a marker," Connie said, her eyes alight with discovery. "It's a clue, a piece of a larger puzzle." Steve leaned over the map, tracing a line between the locations they had visited. All of these sites, Geysir, Hekla, Laki, and now Vatnajökull, they're all connected. But what's the endgame? What were they mapping? Connie tapped a spot near Grimsvötn. Maybe it's not just about mining or geology. Maybe they were trying to understand something bigger, the relationship between fire and ice and how this land works. Steve nodded, his expression thoughtful. "And now it's our turn to follow the trail." As they packed up their gear and prepared for the drive back, Connie glanced at the glacier one last time. "This place feels like it's trying to tell us something," she said softly. "We just have to figure out how to listen." Steve smiled, his hand resting on her shoulder. "We'll figure it out, one step at a time." Chapter 12. Back to Reykjavik. The SUV rumbled along the winding road, back to Reykjavik, its tires crunching over gravel as Connie and Steve left the vast wilderness of Vatnajökull behind. The morning light cast long shadows across the rugged terrain, painting the black lava fields and moss-covered rocks in shades of gold and green. For a while, neither of them spoke, the weight of their discoveries sitting between them like a third passenger. Finally, Connie broke the silence. "I can't stop thinking about that symbol," she said, her voice thoughtful. "The way it was carved, the detail, it feels like it was meant to last forever." Steve nodded, keeping his eyes on the road. "It's strange, isn't it? Whoever made those marks wasn't just leaving directions. They were trying to say something they wanted others to find." Connie turned in her seat to face him. But what were they trying to communicate? Was it just about the sulfur, or was there something more? The journal makes it sound like they were uncovering something bigger. Steve glanced at her briefly, his expression serious. "Maybe it's both. The sulfur was important for survival and trade, but Iceland's geology is unique. They might have realized how connected everything was. The glaciers, the volcanoes, the geothermal vents." Connie leaned her head against the window, watching the scenery blur past. "Do you ever wonder why we're so drawn to this? Most people would have just taken a picture of the symbol and moved on, but we can't let it go." Steve chuckled. "Yeah, I've been thinking about that. I guess it's the thrill of figuring out a mystery. It's like reading a book where the ending hasn't been written yet, and we get to write it." Connie smiled, but her eyes remained on the horizon. "For me, it's more than that. It's like we're connecting with people who lived hundreds of years ago, trying to understand the same land we're standing on. It makes you realize how small we are, but also how much we share with them." Steve nodded. "That's true. It's like their story is still alive, written in the rocks and the ice, and somehow we stumbled into it." The road began to climb, offering a sweeping view of the coastline. To their left, waves crashed against jagged black cliffs, sending up sprays of white foam. To their right, the land stretched into the distance, dotted with steaming vents and distant peaks. Connie sighed, her voice softer now. "This place is so much more than I imagined. It's not just beautiful, it's alive. The glaciers groaning, the geysers erupting, the volcanoes rumbling. It's like the land is constantly reminding you how powerful it is." Steve tightened his grip on the wheel. It's humbling, for sure, and it makes you think about the people who lived here before modern technology, how they made sense of all this. Connie nodded. Exactly. The journal shows that they weren't just surviving, they were observing, learning, adapting. That's why these symbols matter. They're a record of how they saw the world. Steve smiled. And now we're seeing it through their eyes. Kind of makes you feel like a part of something bigger, doesn't it? As the kilometers ticked by, their conversation shifted to their meeting with Arnie. What do you think he'll say about the journal? Connie asked. Steve shrugged. He's already given us so much insight. I think he'll help us make sense of the patterns we're seeing. Maybe he'll even point us to other archives or sites we haven't considered yet. Connie tapped her fingers on the dashboard, her excitement building. I hope so. I feel like we're on the verge of something big, like all these pieces are going to come together in a way we didn't expect. Steve glanced at her, a grin tugging at his lips. That's what makes this so fun. We have no idea what's coming next. Connie laughed, but her gaze grew serious again. Whatever it is, I want to honor the story we're uncovering. It's not just about us, it's about them. The people who left these marks, who worked this land, who saw its power and tried to understand it. Steve nodded. And now it's our turn to follow the trail. Let's make it count. As they neared the city, the colorful rooftops of Reykjavik came into view, nestled against the backdrop of the ocean. Connie sat up straighter, her energy renewed. Time to see what Arnie has for us, she said, her voice tinged with anticipation. Steve grinned. And maybe grab some real food. I'm pretty sure I've reached my lifetime limit of protein bars. Connie laughed, but her thoughts were already on the meeting ahead. They were closer than ever to uncovering the story behind the symbols, and she couldn't wait to take the next step. Chapter 13, Arnie's Insights. Reykjavik's National Museum was a quiet haven of history amidst the bustling city. Connie and Steve arrived early, their anticipation mounting as they passed through the exhibit halls showcasing Iceland's rich cultural and geological heritage. Artifacts from the Viking Age sat beside displays of modern geothermal innovations, a juxtaposition that mirrored their own journey through Iceland's past and present. Arnie Bjornsson greeted them warmly in his office. He looked every bit the historian, with his neatly combed gray hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and a faint dusting of chalk on his sleeves. The room was lined with shelves brimming with books and documents, and an old map of Iceland hung prominently on the wall behind his desk. Connie, Steve, Arnie said, shaking their hands. It's good to see you again. I've been looking forward to this conversation. We have so much to share, Connie said, placing her bag on the desk and pulling out the journal and their collection of photos. Arnie examined the journal carefully, flipping through its yellowed pages. His expression shifted between curiosity and admiration. This is remarkable, he said. The detail, the handwriting, it's a window into a world that was both perilous and innovative. Steve leaned forward. We found these symbols at multiple sites, Geysir, Hekla, Laki, Vatnajökull, and they seem to follow a pattern, but we don't know what it all adds up to. Arnie nodded, gesturing to the map on his wall. Let's take a closer look. You mentioned the phrase in the journal, the key lies where the fire meets the ice. That's a poetic way of describing Iceland itself, but it could also point to specific regions where geothermal and glacial forces intersect. He traced his finger along the map, connecting the locations they had explored. These markers align with Iceland's volcanic belt, specifically along the mid-Atlantic ridge. It's no coincidence that these areas were prime sites for sulfur extraction. But the symbols you've found suggest a deeper purpose, perhaps an attempt to map the geothermal energy of the land. Connie tapped the journal. But why map it this way? Was it just for mining, or were they trying to understand something bigger? Arnie leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. Icelanders of that era were deeply connected to the land. They knew its power and its dangers. It's possible these symbols were part of an early effort to harness geothermal energy, not in the way we think of it now, but as a way to predict eruptions or understand the forces shaping the land. Steve frowned. So they weren't just mining sulfur, they were studying the earth itself? Exactly, Arnie said. And remember, Icelandic folklore often blends the practical with the mystical. While these symbols may seem scientific to us, They could also have been seen as protective or guiding. To those who carved them, they might have represented both knowledge and reverence for the land. Steve pulled out the photos of the carvings at Vatnajökull. What about this? The symbol here is more intricate than the others, almost like a map within a map. Arnie studied the photo, his eyes narrowing. This is fascinating. It appears to reference geological features, perhaps geothermal vents or fissures. And this marking here, he said, pointing to a specific curve, is consistent with the Askja region. Askja, Connie repeated, her excitement growing. You mentioned that in your email. It's a volcanic caldera, right? Yes, Arnie said, nodding. Askja is one of Iceland's most dramatic volcanic regions. It's also remote, which means any markers left there would likely be well preserved. If the people who created these symbols were studying the land's most dynamic forces, Askja would be a logical place for them to focus. Connie and Steve exchanged a glance, their decision made. That has to be our next stop, Steve said. Arnie smiled. I thought you might say that. I've prepared some additional resources for you. Maps, weather reports, and notes on Askja's history. The journey won't be easy, but I have no doubt you're up to the challenge. As they gathered their materials, Connie couldn't resist asking one more question. Why do you think they stopped? The journal and symbols are so detailed, but there's no modern continuation of this work. Arnie's expression grew somber. Many factors could explain that. Changing economic priorities, the difficulty of the work, even natural disasters. But I believe their work wasn't lost. It evolved. Iceland's modern geothermal industry owes much to the observations and experiments of those early pioneers. The symbols you're following are a reminder that understanding the land is a continuous process, one that began long before us and will continue long after. As Connie and Steve left the museum, their bags heavier with maps and notes, they felt a renewed sense of purpose. The trail they were following wasn't just about uncovering the past, it was about connecting it to the present and future. Askja, Connie said as they walked to the SUV. It sounds like the toughest part of the journey yet. Steve grinned. And the most rewarding. Let's see what the fire and ice have to show us this time. Connie smiled, her excitement tempered by a growing respect for the land and its stories. Whatever we find, I think it's going to change the way we see this place and ourselves. Chapter 14. The Journey to Askja. The road to Askja was unlike anything Connie and Steve had encountered before. As they left the relative comfort of Reykjavik behind, the landscape grew more rugged and remote. The paved roads gave way to gravel tracks, cutting through vast stretches of volcanic desert, where the only signs of life were the occasional mossy patches clinging to jagged rocks. Connie stared out the window, her breath catching at the sheer desolation of the highlands. It's like we're driving on the moon, she said softly. Steve nodded, his hands steady on the wheel. Yeah, except the moon probably doesn't have rivers cutting through it. Ahead, a glacial river snaked across the road, its icy waters shimmering in the midday sun. Steve slowed the SUV and engaged its four-wheel drive, carefully navigating through the shallow ford. Connie leaned forward, her camera in hand. This place feels so untouched. It's incredible. Untouched, Steve echoed, glancing at her. And unforgiving. Let's stay sharp. We're a long way from help if something goes wrong. The further they drove, the more the terrain tested their endurance. Volcanic sand swirled around them, kicked up by the wind, and the road became a maze of potholes and sharp rocks. Glad we rented this beast, Steve said, patting the dashboard of the rugged SUV. No way our car back home could handle this. Connie smiled, though her grip on the map tightened. According to Arnie's notes, we'll need to park near Drekki Hut and hike the rest of the way to the caldera. It's not too far, but we'll need to be careful. As they approached the Drekki Hut, a small, isolated refuge for travelers, the stark beauty of Askja began to reveal itself. Towering volcanic ridges framed the horizon, and in the distance, they could see the shimmering surface of Lake Öskjuvatn, the deep crater lake formed during a massive eruption in 1875. After parking the SUV and double-checking their gear, Connie and Steve set off on foot. The trail was marked but rough, winding through a surreal landscape of black sand and volcanic rock. The air was crisp and dry, carrying the faint scent of sulfur from geothermal vents nearby. This is the most remote place we've been so far, Connie said, her voice echoing slightly in the stillness. I can't believe people used to work out here. Steve adjusted his backpack, scanning the horizon. They must have been tough as nails. Imagine hauling equipment through this terrain. As they climbed higher, the view of the caldera opened up before them. Lake Usquevatten gleamed like a sapphire in the sun, its surface so still it seemed like a mirror. Beside it was Viti, a smaller crater filled with milky blue geothermal water. This is breathtaking, Connie said, pausing to take a photo. And eerie, Steve added. It's beautiful, but it feels like it's hiding something. As they neared the edge of Viti, Connie's sharp intake of breath made Steve turn. She pointed to a flat stone jutting from the ground near a cluster of boulders. They knelt together, brushing away the ash to reveal concentric circles radiating outward. Another marker, Connie said, her voice hushed. But this one feels different. Steve took out the journal, comparing the carving to the sketches. This one's unique. It looks like it's meant to represent a convergence, maybe? Like everything we found is pointing here. Nearby, they found another iron stake embedded in the ground, its rusted plate bearing the inscription, Survey Site, Askja, 1875. This must have been one of the last places they marked, Steve said, right before or after the eruption. Connie nodded, her mind racing. The concentric circles, they could represent the caldera, the lakes, or even the geothermal activity below. It's like they were mapping the energy of the land itself. As they sat near the edge of the crater, Connie stared out at the vast expanse of Askja, her thoughts swirling. This place, it's a reminder of how powerful and unpredictable the Earth is. The people who worked here must have known that better than anyone. Steve nodded, his gaze fixed on the lake, and they still tried to understand it. These symbols, the journal, it's all part of that effort. It's humbling, really. Connie smiled faintly, and inspiring. They left us a trail not just to follow, but to learn from. It's like they wanted us to see the world the way they did. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, they started their descent back to Drekki Hut. The trail was more challenging in the fading light, and the temperature dropped sharply. Careful, Steve said, glancing back at Connie. One wrong step here could end badly. Connie nodded, her focus on the uneven ground. Despite the difficulty, she couldn't shake the sense of exhilaration that came with their discovery. When they finally reached the hut, they were exhausted but triumphant. The journey to Askja had pushed them to their limits, but it had also brought them closer to understanding the story behind the symbols and the people who had carved them. That evening, as they sat by the wood stove in the tiny hut, Connie pulled out her notebook and began jotting down their observations. Steve studied the photos on his laptop, tracing the connections between the markers they had found. We're not just following a trail, Steve said after a while. We're uncovering a mindset, a way of seeing the land that's as relevant now as it was then. Connie looked up, her eyes bright. And it's not just about the past. It's about how we move forward, how we live with the land, not against it. Steve smiled. Well, whatever's next, I'm all in. Connie nodded, a sense of determination settling over her. Me too. Let's see where this journey takes us. Chapter 15. Reflections and Plans. The Drekki hut was quiet that evening, save for the occasional crackle of the wood stove. The small space felt cozy despite the rugged environment outside, and Connie and Steve sat across from each other at a simple wooden table. Between them lay their growing collection of maps, notes, photos, and the journal that had guided their journey so far. Steve poured steaming water from a kettle into 2 tin mugs, handing one to Connie. Tea's not fancy, but it'll do, he said with a grin. Connie took the mug gratefully, wrapping her hands around it. It's perfect, especially after today. I still can't believe we found that symbol. It's like the trail keeps unfolding in ways we couldn't have predicted. Steve nodded, leaning back in his chair. Askja felt different, though, more intense. The scale of it, the history behind it. It's hard not to feel like we're standing at the edge of something huge. Connie picked up one of the photos they had taken of the Askja symbol. The concentric circles were etched deeply into the stone, their precision hinting at the care and intent of the people who had carved them. This symbol, she said, tracing its outline with her finger, it feels like a culmination, like everything we've found so far has been leading to this point. Steve leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. If that's true, then the journal might hold the next clue. What do you think the circles represent? Connie frowned, flipping through the journal's pages. They could represent the caldera and the lakes, or maybe they're symbolic, showing how everything we've seen so far is connected. Fire and ice, geothermal energy, the volcanic belt, it all comes together here. Steve tapped the table thoughtfully. Arnie mentioned that the people who left these markers were likely trying to map the land's energy. What if Askja was the center of their work? The place where they believed everything converged? Connie nodded slowly. That would make sense. But if this is the center, then what's next? Did they stop here, or is there more to the story? Steve pulled out the map they had been using to chart their journey. If there's more, it might be further along the volcanic belt. Look here, he said, pointing to an area near Krafla, a volcanic system in northeastern Iceland. This region is active, and it's known for its geothermal features. It could be another piece of the puzzle. Connie studied the map, her excitement building. Krafla has those geothermal power plants too, doesn't it? That ties into what we've been finding, how people have worked with the land to harness its energy. Steve grinned. Plus, it's close to Lac Mývatn. If we're heading up there, we could explore the region and see how it connects to the story we're uncovering. As they continued to plan, Connie paused, her gaze drifting to the window. Outside, the stars glittered against the inky black sky, their light unimpeded by city glare. This journey has been so much more than I expected, she said quietly. I thought we were just exploring Iceland, but it feels like we're uncovering a story that was waiting for us to find it. Steve reached across the table, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. We are, and we're part of it now. Every step we take, every discovery we make, it's connecting us to the people who came before us and the land itself. Connie smiled, her resolve strengthening. Then let's keep going. Let's see where this story leads. The next morning, they set about preparing for their journey to the Krafla region. The highlands had been a test of their endurance, and they knew the northeastern volcanic zone would present its own challenges. Gear check. They carefully inspected their equipment, ensuring their crampons, ice axes, and other hiking tools were in good condition. Supplies. They stocked up on food, water, and fuel for their portable stove, knowing that the remote region might offer few amenities. Vehicle maintenance. Steve checked the SUV's tires, oil, and fuel levels, topping off everything to ensure they wouldn't run into trouble on the rugged roads. Research. Connie reached out to Arnie via email, updating him on their findings and asking for any additional insights or historical context about Krafla and its geothermal significance. By midday, they were ready to hit the road. As they loaded their gear into the SUV, Connie glanced at Steve with a smile. Ready for the next chapter? Steve grinned. Always. Let's see what Krafla has to tell us. Chapter 16. The Road to Krafla. The journey to Krafla took Connie and Steve from the rugged isolation of the highlands to the surreal landscapes of northeastern Iceland. As they drove, the scenery shifted dramatically. The vast, blackened deserts gave way to fields of vibrant green moss, steaming geothermal vents, and lakes of astonishingly blue water. This part of the country feels so different, Connie said, staring out the window. It's like every region of Iceland has its own personality. Steve nodded, navigating a sharp curve in the gravel road. Yeah, and this one seems more volatile. Look at all that steam coming out of the ground. Ahead of them, plumes of steam rose from vents scattered across the landscape, curling skyward like ghostly pillars. The air outside carried a faint scent of sulfur, a reminder of the geothermal activity simmering just below the surface. Their first stop was Lake Mývatn, a shallow but expansive body of water surrounded by unique geological formations and teeming with bird life. The lake's surface glittered under the midday sun, reflecting the strange, knobby lava pillars that jutted out like ancient sculptures. This place is incredible, Connie said as they stepped out of the SUV. It feels so alive, but in a completely different way than the glacier. Steve stretched, taking in the view. And it's not just the scenery. Look at all the birds. This lake must be a haven for them. As they walked along a trail near the shore, they noticed signs explaining the area's geothermal history. Mývatn and its surrounding landscapes were shaped by volcanic eruptions thousands of years ago, leaving behind a patchwork of craters, lava fields, and hot springs. Even here, you can see how fire and water shape everything, Connie said, snapping photos of the lava pillars. It's like the land is constantly being rewritten. From Mývatn, it was a short drive to Krafla, one of Iceland's most active volcanic systems. The area was home to the Krafla Power Station, a geothermal facility that harnessed the energy of the earth to provide electricity for the region. Connie was immediately struck by the juxtaposition of natural and industrial elements. The power station's sleek pipes and turbines contrasted sharply with the rugged terrain of steaming vents and fissures. "It's amazing how they've managed to work with the land instead of against it," she said. "This whole place feels like a partnership between nature and people." Steve pointed toward a trailhead that wound up the side of a ridge. "That path leads to the Lernukur lava fields. Arnie said it's one of the most active areas in the region. If we're going to find another symbol, it'll be up there." The trail to Lernukur was otherworldly. The ground was a patchwork of hardened lava, cracked and rippled like a frozen ocean. Steam rose from fissures, and small pools of bubbling mud hissed and popped. "This is incredible," Connie said, her voice tinged with awe. "It's like walking on the edge of the earth." Steve laughed nervously. "Let's hope it doesn't fall apart while we're here." They moved cautiously, following the marked trail to avoid stepping on unstable ground. The sulfuric smell grew stronger as they ascended, and the heat radiating from the vents was palpable, even through their sturdy boots. Near the edge of the lava fields, Connie spotted a flat rock that stood out against the jagged terrain. Its surface was smooth, as if it had been placed there deliberately. "Steve, over here!" she called, pointing to the rock. As they approached, the now familiar carvings came into view. The symbol etched into the stone was intricate, combining elements they had seen at other sites: concentric circles, intersecting lines, and spirals that seemed to radiate outward. "This is it," Connie said, her pulse quickening. "Another marker." Steve crouched down, tracing the carvings with his fingers. It's like they were refining the design with each site. This one feels complete. Nearby, they found another iron stake with an engraved plate. "Survey marker, Krafla, 1910. "This was one of the last places they marked," Steve said, his voice thoughtful. "The designs are so deliberate, so precise. It's like they knew exactly what they were looking for." Connie nodded, her mind racing. "And they wanted others to find it too. But why here? What's so special about this spot?" As they began their descent, Connie and Steve couldn't stop discussing the significance of their discovery. "This region is one of the most geologically active places in Iceland," Steve said. "If they were mapping geothermal energy, Krafla would have been a key site." Connie glanced back at the lava fields, their jagged peaks glowing faintly in the setting sun. "And it's still active. That's what's so incredible. This story isn't just about the past. It's still happening." Steve smiled. "And we're part of it now. These symbols, the journal, they're connecting us to something bigger than ourselves." Back at their guest house near Mývatn, they spread out their maps and notes once more. The journey had taken them from the geysers of the Golden Circle to the glaciers of Vatnajökull, and now to the fiery heart of Krafla. "We followed the symbols this far," Connie said, tapping a spot on the map near the northern coast. "But there's one more place Arnie mentioned, Eyjafjallajökull. It's another geothermal area, and it might hold the final piece of the puzzle." Steve nodded, his excitement tempered by the weight of the journey. "Then that's where we'll go next. Let's see where this story ends, or where it begins." As they prepared for the next leg of their adventure, the sense of purpose they had felt since finding the journal grew stronger. The trail was leading them deeper into Iceland's heart, and they were determined to uncover its secrets. Chapter 17. The Journey to Eyjafjallajökull. The morning broke clear and cold as Connie and Steve packed up their gear for the next leg of their journey. Eyjafjallajökull, a remote geothermal area in northeastern Iceland, was their destination. The name had come up during their conversation with Arnie, who mentioned it as another significant site tied to Iceland's history of harnessing geothermal energy. As they loaded their SUV, Connie glanced at the map one last time. It's not far from here, but the roads look rough. At least we're getting good at navigating Iceland's wilderness. Steve grinned, shutting the trunk. And we've got the SUV to thank for that. Let's hope it handles the last stretch as well as it's handled the rest. The drive to Eyjafjallajökull took them deeper into Iceland's northeastern highlands. The landscape was stark and surreal, a patchwork of moss-covered lava fields, steaming vents, and jagged volcanic ridges. The dirt road wound through this otherworldly terrain, sometimes narrowing to little more than a rocky path. "This feels like the most remote place yet," Connie said, her voice tinged with awe. "It's like we've left civilization behind completely." Steve nodded, his hands steady on the wheel. "It's humbling. You look around and realize how small we are compared to all this." As they approached the Eyjafjallajökull, the air grew warmer, and the scent of sulfur intensified. Steam vents hissed and gurgled on either side of the road, sending plumes of white vapor skyward. "This must be it," Steve said, pointing to a small parking area near a geothermal field. The Eyjafjallajökull. They stepped out of the SUV and were immediately struck by the raw energy of the landscape. The ground beneath their boots was warm to the touch, and the air shimmered with heat rising from the vents. Pools of bubbling mud and streaks of bright orange and yellow soil added splashes of color to the otherwise monochromatic terrain. "This place feels alive," Connie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's like the earth is breathing." Steve adjusted his backpack. "Let's see if we can find anything." Arnie mentioned that the Eyjafjallajökull was historically significant, but I'm curious if there's another symbol here. They followed a faint trail through the geothermal field, carefully navigating around the steaming vents and bubbling pools. The air was thick with the smell of sulfur, but the beauty of the place was undeniable. Near the edge of the geothermal field, Connie spotted a flat stone partially buried in the earth. Her heart quickened as she brushed away the dirt, revealing the now familiar carvings. "Steve, over here," she called. Steve hurried over, crouching beside her. The symbol etched into the stone was intricate, combining elements from all the markers they had found so far. Concentric circles radiated outward, intersecting with spirals and straight lines that seemed to form a web of connections. "This one's different," Connie said, her voice filled with awe. "It's like it's tying everything together." Nearby, they found an iron stake with an engraved plate. "Geothermal Survey, the Eyjafjallajökull, 1925. "This must have been one of the last surveys they conducted," Steve said, snapping photos. "It's incredible how much thought and precision went into these markings." Connie nodded, her mind racing. It's like they were trying to leave a legacy, not just of their work, but of their understanding of the land. As they sat near the marker, gazing out at the steaming vents and distant mountains, Connie couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. Connie stared at the final marker, her voice steady. "This journey has changed the way I see everything. I used to think travel was about seeing places, but it's about understanding them, and understanding yourself in the process." Steve nodded, his smile reflective. "Yeah, these markers, they're not just about where we've been, they're about what we've become. We came here to explore the land, but I think we've discovered a lot more about who we are." Connie leaned against him, a contented smile on her face. "And I think that's the real story we've uncovered. The story of how people worked with the land, learned from it, and left behind something to guide others." As the sun began to dip below the horizon, they returned to the SUV and began the drive back toward civilization. Their minds buzzed with everything they had discovered and the questions that still lingered. "We should meet with Arnie one more time before we leave Iceland," Connie said. "He'll want to know what we've found, and he might have insights we haven't considered yet." Steve nodded. "Agreed. And I think we need to write all this down, every symbol, every site, every connection. This journey has been incredible, but it's not just for us. Other people need to see this too." Connie smiled, her excitement renewed. "Let's do it. Let's tell the story of fire and ice and the people who understood it better than anyone." As they drove through the darkening landscape, the headlights cutting a path through the wilderness, Connie and Steve felt a sense of purpose stronger than ever. They had followed the symbols across Iceland, uncovering a story that was as much about the past as it was about the present and the future. Chapter 18. Back to Reykjavik. The drive back to Reykjavik was bittersweet. Connie and Steve felt the satisfaction of uncovering the final marker at etched, but their journey across Iceland had been so transformative that the thought of it coming to an end left them reflective. "This country feels like it's changed me," Connie said, staring out at the rolling lava fields and steaming vents that had become familiar sights over the past weeks. Steve glanced at her, a knowing smile on his face. "Me too. It's like Iceland has a way of showing you how big the world really is, and how small you are in comparison, but in a good way." As the kilometers rolled by, their conversation drifted between the discoveries they had made and the memories they had created. They passed Loch Mývatn one last time, its glassy surface reflecting the sky, and crossed the vast stretches of black sand plains that marked the edge of the highlands. By the time they reached Reykjavik, the city's colorful rooftops and bustling streets felt almost surreal after the remote landscapes they had explored. Arni Bjornsson greeted them warmly at the National Museum. His office, with its shelves of old books and artifacts, felt like a fitting place to reflect on their journey. "You've certainly covered a lot of ground," Arni said, motioning for them to sit. "I've been following your updates with great interest. Tell me, what did you find at the etched?" Connie pulled out her laptop, showing Arni the photos they had taken of the final marker. "It's the most intricate symbol we've found," she explained. "It combines elements from all the previous sites, concentric circles, spirals, intersecting lines. It feels like it's tying everything together." Arni examined the photos closely, his expression thoughtful. "This is remarkable," he said after a moment. "The precision of the carvings suggests that the people who created these markers had a clear understanding of what they were documenting. The etched was likely a culmination of their work, a place where they believed the forces of the land converged most powerfully." Steve leaned forward, his excitement evident. "Do you think they were mapping geothermal energy? Or was it something more symbolic?" Arni nodded. "Both, perhaps. The markers serve a practical purpose. They highlight areas of geothermal and volcanic significance, but they also reflect a deeper relationship with the land. To the people who created them, these places weren't just resources. They were sacred, powerful, and deserving of respect." Connie tapped the table thoughtfully. "That's what we've been feeling this whole time. Every site we visited felt alive, like the land was telling a story." Arni smiled. "And you've listened. That's what makes your journey so important. You've not only uncovered these markers, but you've connected with the spirit behind them, the recognition that the land and its forces shape us as much as we shape them." As their conversation continued, Arni suggested ways to preserve and share their findings. "Your discoveries are significant, not just for historians and geologists, but for anyone interested in Iceland's heritage. Have you considered documenting your journey in a book or a digital archive?" Steve nodded. "We've talked about it. The symbols, the journal, the sites, they're all pieces of a larger story. We want to make sure it's accessible to people who are as curious about the land as we are." Connie added, "And not just the discoveries, the journey itself, what it taught us about Iceland, its history, and the people who lived and worked here. That's just as important." Arni smiled warmly. "I think that's a wonderful idea. The markers may have been carved centuries ago, but their message is timeless. By sharing their story, you'll ensure that their legacy lives on." As they left Arni's office, Connie and Steve felt a sense of closure, but also a new beginning. Their journey across Iceland had been about more than uncovering symbols. It had been about connecting with the land, its history, and its people. Standing outside the museum, Connie looked up at the clear Icelandic sky. "I feel like we've come full circle," she said softly, "but there's still so much more to learn." Steve nodded, slipping his arm around her shoulders. "And I think that's the point. The story doesn't end here. It keeps going, just like the land itself." As they walked back to their SUV, the streets of Reykjavik bustling around them, Connie and Steve felt a renewed sense of purpose. They were ready to share the story of their journey, not just as an adventure, but as a testament to the enduring connection between people and the earth. Chapter 19, Building a Legacy. Back at their guest house in Reykjavik, Connie and Steve sat at a small wooden table, their collection of photos, notes, maps, and the weathered journals spread before them. The glow of a desk lamp illuminated their findings, casting long shadows on the walls. It was their last evening in Iceland, but instead of winding down, they felt a renewed energy, a drive to honor the journey they had embarked upon. Connie stared at the journal, her fingers gently tracing its worn leather cover. "This isn't just ours anymore," she said softly. "We've uncovered something that connects so many people, past and present. We owe it to them to share it." Steve nodded, his gaze fixed on a photo of the intricate symbol at the Österreicher. "This journey has been incredible, but it's not just about what we've seen. It's about what these markers represent, how people saw the land, respected it, and worked with it. That's something the world needs to hear." Connie smiled, though her expression was thoughtful. "Do you think we can do it justice? This story is so much bigger than us." Steve reached for her hand. "That's what makes it worth telling. And I think we've already started. Every photo we've taken, every note we've written, every conversation we've had with Arnie and others, it's all part of the story." Over the next few hours, they brainstormed ways to preserve and share their discoveries. A book. Connie suggested writing a book that chronicled their journey, blending their personal experiences with the history and geology of Iceland. It wouldn't just be about the symbols, she explained. It would be about how they shaped our understanding of this land and ourselves. Digital archive. Steve proposed creating an interactive digital archive where people could explore the markers through photos, maps, and 3D reconstructions. Imagine being able to click on each symbol and learn its history, see where it was found, and understand its significance, he said, his enthusiasm growing. Educational outreach. They discussed collaborating with Arnie and the National Museum to create educational resources for schools and universities. "This is part of Iceland's heritage," Connie said. "It belongs to everyone, especially the next generation." As they finalized their plans, Connie grew quiet for a moment, her thoughts turning to the larger implications of their journey. "We talk about these symbols as if they're relics," she said, "but they're not. They're reminders. They remind us of how connected we are to the land and how much we depend on it. That's a lesson we can't afford to forget, especially now." Steve nodded. "You're right. The people who carved those markers weren't just documenting. They were living in harmony with the forces that shaped their world. If we can learn from them, maybe we can do better in how we treat the earth today." Connie's eyes lit up. "That's the legacy we should aim for, not just preserving history, but using it to inspire change. If we can share that message, then this journey will have been worth it." The next morning, as they boarded their flight back to Canada, Connie and Steve felt a mix of emotions. They were leaving Iceland, but they knew their connection to the country and its story would stay with them. Looking out the airplane window at the snow-covered peaks below, Connie turned to Steve. "This is just the beginning, isn't it?" Steve smiled, his confidence unshakable. "Absolutely. We've started something bigger than ourselves, and now it's time to see it through." As the plane ascended into the clouds, they felt a sense of purpose stronger than ever. They weren't just travelers. They were storytellers, stewards of a legacy that had been carved into the stones of Iceland, waiting to be uncovered and shared with the world.